America's darkest hour produced its most audacious strike. On April 18, 1942, just 132 days after Pearl Harbor, 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier in the most improbable military operation of World War II. What followed was an epic of courage, sacrifice, and consequences that would reshape the Pacific War. The Doolittle Raid inflicted minimal physical damage on Japan, yet its psychological and strategic impact proved devastating. It lifted American morale from its lowest point, humiliated Japanese military leadership, and set in motion the chain of decisions that led directly to Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway 7 weeks later. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and sank or damaged 19 ships on December 7, 1941. But the material losses paled against the psychological devastation. In the weeks that followed, Japan's military machine swept across the Pacific with terrifying efficiency. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, Guam on December 10th, Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, collapsed on February 15, 1942, in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines were being systematically conquered. Bataan would fall on April 9th. Americans listened to their radios in growing despair. Library of Congress recordings captured citizens' raw fear that Japanese bombers might soon appear over Los Angeles or San Francisco. The watchword "Remember Pearl Harbor" rang hollow. Remembering was easy, but striking back seemed impossible. Japan appeared invincible. On December 21, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt summoned his Joint Chiefs to the White House and declared that Japan should be bombed as soon as possible to boost public morale. The problem was devastatingly simple. Nobody knew how. The nearest American bases were thousands of miles from Tokyo. Navy carrier aircraft had a combat radius of only 300 miles, bringing a carrier that close to Japan would be suicide. America needed a miracle. The miracle began with a glance out a window. On January 10, 1942, Navy Captain Francis S. Frog Lowe was at Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, inspecting the newly commissioned USS Hornet. While waiting for his aircraft to be prepared, Lowe looked out and saw something that ignited an impossible idea. The outline of a carrier flight deck painted on a nearby runway, with 2 Army twin-engine bombers sweeping past on practice runs. The connection struck like lightning. If Army bombers could take off from that painted deck, could they take off from a real carrier? Navy planes couldn't reach Tokyo, but Army bombers had far greater range. Lowe rushed to Washington and approached Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, with 5 words that would change history. "Sir, I've got an idea for bombing Japan." King immediately grasped the concept's potential. He assigned Captain Donald B. Duncan to conduct a feasibility study. Over 5 days, Duncan produced a 30-page analysis that identified the North American B-25 Mitchell bomber as the only aircraft capable of executing the mission. Its wingspan of 67 feet, 6 inches, was narrow enough to operate from a carrier deck, though too wide to fit on the elevators to the hangar bay. With modifications, its range could be extended from 1,300 to 2,400 miles. Most critically, tests suggested it could become airborne in the carrier's available deck space. On January 17th, General Henry H. Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, reviewed the proposal and immediately approved it as a joint Army-Navy operation, the first major combined service operation since the Civil War. Before the raid could proceed, one fundamental question had to be answered. Could a B-25 actually take off from a carrier deck? On February 2, 1942, the USS Hornet steamed into the waters off the Virginia Capes, carrying 2 lightly loaded B-25Bs. At 1:27 p.m., Lieutenant John E. Fitzgerald was given the signal. He released his brakes, accelerated down the deck, and lifted smoothly into the sky. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant James F. McCarthy used only 275 feet of deck, far less than available, to accomplish the same feat. Fitzgerald later marveled at the physics involved. With Hornet steaming into the wind at full speed, The airspeed indicator showed 45 miles per hour just sitting there before he even started his takeoff roll. The test had proven what many thought impossible. But one critical detail remained unresolved. While takeoff was feasible, landing a B-25 back on a carrier was virtually impossible. This would be a one-way mission. General Arnold needed someone extraordinary to plan and lead this operation. He chose Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, arguably the most accomplished aviator alive. Doolittle's credentials were staggering. Born in 1896 in Alameda, California, he held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from embarked, the first ever awarded in the United States. He had set transcontinental speed records, won all 3 major American air racing trophies, and in 1929 became the first pilot in history to take off, fly, and land an aircraft using instruments alone, blind flying, that revolutionized aviation. He had performed maneuvers other pilots considered fatal, including the first ever outside loop. At 45, he was a legend. Arnold assigned Doolittle to plan Special Aviation Project No. 1. But Doolittle wanted more than planning duties. He wanted to lead the mission himself. Arnold initially refused, considering Doolittle too valuable to risk. Doolittle employed a tactical maneuver. When Arnold finally relented contingent on approval from Chief of Staff General Miff Harmon, Doolittle literally ran down the hall to Harmon's office before Arnold could call ahead. "Hap said it was okay with him if it's okay with you," Doolittle told Harmon. Caught off guard, Harmon agreed. Doolittle made a hasty retreat as Arnold's voice came over Harmon's intercom moments later. For crews, Doolittle turned to the 17th Bombardment Group, the 1st Army Air Corps unit to receive B-25s. Volunteers were told only that they were needed for a mission that would be extremely hazardous and of great value to our defense effort. No other details were provided. Every man who was asked stepped forward. From 24 crews initially selected, 16 would fly the mission, 80 men total. They ranged from 20-year-old Corporal Leland Factor to Doolittle himself at 45. Among them were future POWs, future authors, a future missionary, and men who would not survive the next 48 hours. Training began in early March 1942 at Eglin Field in Florida's Panhandle. Navy Lieutenant Henry L. Miller arrived from Pensacola to teach Army pilots skills they had never imagined needing. His first words created confusion. "I'm here to teach you how to take off from an aircraft carrier." Miller had never flown a B-25 before arriving. He quickly learned. White lines were painted on runways to simulate a carrier deck 500 feet long. Pilots learned to lift bombers weighing 31,000 pounds, 2 tons over the official maximum, into the air in under 350 feet using a 40-knot headwind. They practiced low-altitude flying at 200 feet, night flying, over-water navigation across the Gulf of Mexico, and precision bombing at minimal altitude. The B-25s underwent radical modification. Additional fuel tanks boosted range. The lower gun turret was removed. It caused air sickness and was difficult to aim. Radios were stripped to save weight. The sophisticated Norden bomb sight was replaced with a simple device designed by Captain Ross Greening that cost 20 cents to manufacture. And 2 wooden broomsticks, painted black, were mounted in each tail cone to simulate heavy machine guns, a subterfuge that would prove remarkably effective against pursuing fighters. Doolittle wanted 50 hours of training per crew. Weather, mechanical problems, and time constraints meant they achieved roughly half that. 2 aircraft were damaged in training accidents. The crews were dropped from the mission. On March 23rd, the final day of training, one B-25 stalled at 15 feet during a takeoff attempt and crashed. The crew survived, but was removed from the roster. Lieutenant Vernon Stintsey developed an ulcer and was replaced by Doolittle himself, who took command of Stintsey's crew. Behind the aircraft and equipment were intensely human stories. Richard Cole, Doolittle's 26-year-old co-pilot, had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, birthplace of the Wright brothers and home to aviation legend. As a boy, Cole had bicycled 25 miles just to catch a glimpse of his hero, Jimmy Doolittle, performing at air shows. Now he would sit beside him on the most dangerous mission of the war. Ted Lawson of Crew 7 had brought his pregnant wife Ellen to Florida during training. The secrecy surrounding the mission meant she couldn't know where he was going or if he would return. Their farewell was shadowed by the knowledge that he might never meet his child. David Thatcher, the 20-year-old flight engineer on Lawson's crew, came from Bridger, Montana, where his family of 12 lived in a dirt enclosure built into a hillside. Too colorblind to qualify as a pilot, he had settled for crew member. He would soon demonstrate that courage has nothing to do with rank. Edward York, pilot of Crew 8, was the only West Point graduate among the Raiders. Born Edward Sikowski to Polish immigrant parents, he had legally changed his surname before the raid, but kept Ski as a nickname. He served as Doolittle's operations officer, meticulous and thorough. Unknown to anyone, depot workers in Sacramento had replaced both carburetors on his aircraft, a modification that would force York into a desperate decision over the Pacific. On April 1, 1942, 16 B-25s were hoisted by crane onto USS Hornet's flight deck at Naval Air Station Alameda in San Francisco Bay. The sight was extraordinary. The bombers filled the deck from bow to stern, their wings nearly touching the ship's superstructure. Hornet's own aircraft were crammed below in the hangar bay with wings folded. The next day, Hornet steamed out under heavy fog, her mission still officially secret. Observers on shore who spotted the bomber-laden carrier assumed it was simply ferrying aircraft. Once at sea, Doolittle gathered the crews and confirmed what most had guessed. "Your destination is Tokyo." For 11 days, the task force plowed westward across the Pacific. Life aboard was monotonous. Briefings, aircraft maintenance, endless poker games. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jerica Jr., who had grown up in Tokyo as the son of a diplomat, provided detailed target briefings. The men studied photographs and maps of Japanese cities most had never imagined they would see. On April 13th, north of Midway Island, Hornet's Task Force 18 rendezvoused with Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. aboard USS Enterprise. The combined force, designated Task Force 16, now comprised 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers, carrying over 10,000 men. Enterprise's fighters would provide air cover since Hornet's flight deck was blocked by the B-25s. Halsey went to Enterprise's loudspeaker with a message that brought cheers from every ship. "This force is bound for Tokyo." The plan called for launching the B-25s 400 miles from Japan at dusk, allowing them to bomb at night and arrive at Chinese airfields in daylight. Everything depended on the element of surprise. Everything changed at 3:10 a.m. on April 18, 1942. Enterprise radar detected 2 surface contacts 21,000 yards off the port bow. Halsey ordered general quarters and changed course to avoid detection. The task force veered 90 degrees, resuming its westerly heading 30 minutes later. But Japan's early warning system, a picket line of 116 radio-equipped fishing trawlers extending 700 to 800 miles offshore, was proving its worth. At 7:38 a.m., lookouts aboard the 90-ton patrol boat number 23 Nitomaru spotted the American carriers. The trawler's radio crackled to life. 2 enemy carriers sighted. The position, approximately 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, 250 miles beyond the planned launch point. Halsey faced an agonizing decision. The task force represented half of America's Pacific carrier strength. 80 Japanese medium bombers were massed in the Kanto area, and 3 carriers were returning from the Indian Ocean. If the trawler's warning reached Japan, and it had, the entire operation might be sailing into a trap. The original plan was impossible. But there was another option. At 8 a.m., a blinker signal flashed from Enterprise to Hornet. "Launch planes," to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command. "Good luck and God bless you, Halsey." The Raiders would launch immediately, 10 hours early, 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned. The implications were severe. They would arrive over their targets in daylight instead of darkness, losing the element of surprise. Far worse, the extra distance meant their fuel calculations were now fantasy. Whether any aircraft could reach China was anyone's guess. Meanwhile, USS Nashville opened fire on Nitomaru. The rough seas made targeting difficult. It took over 900 rounds from the cruiser's 6-inch guns and 45 minutes to finally sink the small trawler at 8:23 a.m. 5 of 11 crew were rescued. The captain committed suicide rather than face capture. The weather had turned vicious. Gale-force winds swept the deck with gusting 30-knot blasts. 30-foot swells sent green water crashing over Hornet's bow. Rain and mist reduced visibility. The carrier pitched and rolled in the heavy seas, her deck rising and falling dramatically. On that pitching deck sat 16 fully loaded B-25s, their combined weight straining the ship's structure. After repositioning to allow engine startup, Doolittle's aircraft had exactly 467 feet of deck. The tail of the 16th plane hung over the stern. 2 white lines had been painted to guide pilots, one for the nose wheel, one for the left main wheel. If they stayed on those lines, their right wingtip would clear the carrier's island superstructure by exactly 6 feet. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle released his brakes. His aircraft rolled forward into the headwind, gathering speed as Hornet's bow rose on a swell. Navy deck handlers, timing the launch to the ship's pitch, had positioned him perfectly. The B-25 reached the deck's edge, dropped toward the churning gray sea. Witnesses reported it almost hit the water, then pulled up and climbed away. The impossible had become real. 5 minutes later, Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft nearly ended in disaster. Launching as a wave lifted Hornet's bow, his B-25 was thrown into the air prematurely. Hoover instinctively yanked back on the stick, and for a terrifying moment the bomber appeared to fall off on a wing toward the ocean. Through superb piloting, he recovered and climbed away. After his harrowing takeoff, Lieutenant Henry Miller recommended a modified technique to the remaining pilots. One by one, the B-25s roared down the deck and lifted into the gray Pacific sky. Navy crews assisted despite the danger. One sailor was blown into a propeller arc and lost his arm, the only launch casualty. At 9:19 a.m., Lieutenant William Farrow's aircraft, the 16th and last, cleared Hornet's deck. Total launch time, 59 minutes. Every aircraft made it. The 16 bombers formed loose groups and headed west, flying at wave-top level to avoid detection. They cruised at 160 to 165 miles per hour to conserve fuel, navigators working with dead reckoning, and occasional celestial fixes. Below them stretched 600 miles of open ocean. Doolittle's aircraft was joined briefly by Hoover's. An hour out, they passed a camouflaged Japanese naval vessel of about 6,000 tons, too small to attack, too dangerous to approach. 2 hours from launch, they spotted a multi-engine Japanese patrol plane heading directly toward the task force they had left behind. Lieutenant Richard Joyce encountered a twin-engine Japanese patrol aircraft 600 miles from Tokyo. "It immediately dove out of the clouds and pursued me," Joyce reported. He firewalled his throttles and managed to outdistance the pursuer, but the close call demonstrated that the element of surprise was thoroughly compromised. After 6 hours of flying, the Chinese coast appeared through scattered clouds. The bombers had navigated more than 650 miles across open ocean without radio aids, arriving within minutes of each other at landfall. They turned toward their targets, descended to minimum altitude, and prepared to bomb the enemy homeland. The raid struck Japan with complete tactical surprise. Despite the picket boat's warning, Japanese military planners had calculated that American carrier aircraft could not reach the home islands from the reported sighting position. They had dispatched fighters and bombers to intercept a threat 300 miles offshore, the maximum range of Navy aircraft. The possibility that Army bombers might be launched from carriers had never occurred to them. Doolittle's aircraft reached Tokyo's northern industrial district at approximately 12:30 p.m. local time. He pulled up to 1,200 feet, released 4 incendiary clusters on what his intelligence briefings identified as a highly flammable manufacturing zone, then dove back to rooftop level and raced southwest. Behind him, columns of smoke began rising into the sky. Lieutenant Travis Hoover struck powder factories and magazines near Tokyo's main railroad station. Dropping from 900 feet, he watched debris from his explosions rise higher than his aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Gray hit steel mills and chemical factories, encountering the first significant resistance. His 20-minute delay had given Japanese defenders time to react. Heavy anti-aircraft fire pursued him as he fought his way toward the coast. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's crew achieved the raid's most significant tactical success, striking Yokosuka Naval Yard. At least one of their 500-pound bombs hit the nearly completed light carrier Ryuho in dry dock, delaying her commissioning until November, a 5-month setback for Japan's desperate carrier replacement program. The other crews scattered across their assigned targets. Tokyo's remaining industrial zones, Yokohama's oil refineries and docks, Nagoya's military barracks and Mitsubishi Aircraft Works, Kobe, and Osaka. Major John Hilger observed the results of his attack on Nagoya. When we were 20 miles south on our way out, we observed a tall column of heavy black smoke with a mushroom head standing over the city. Japanese resistance proved surprisingly ineffective. Doolittle's after-action report noted that defending fighters appeared inexperienced and in many cases failed to drive the attack home. Anti-aircraft fire was active but wildly inaccurate. So poor that gunners aiming at American bombers near their own barrage balloons accidentally shot down some of their own balloons. The fake wooden guns in the B-25 tails achieved their intended effect. Not a single aircraft was attacked directly from behind. American gunners claimed 3 Japanese fighters shot down. Only Lieutenant Richard Joyce's aircraft sustained battle damage, minor hits from anti-aircraft fire. The bombers dropped their payloads and raced for the Chinese coast, leaving behind burning factories, panicking civilians, and a military establishment consumed by humiliation. On the ground, confusion reigned. Japanese civilians had been conducting air raid drills that morning. When American bombers appeared, many assumed the aircraft were part of the exercise. Children in schoolyards waved at the low-flying planes, never having seen B-25s before. The realization that enemy aircraft were bombing their homeland came with devastating psychological force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, received word of the attack at his headquarters aboard battleship Nagato. The news hit him with physical force. He became ill and incapacitated, leaving his chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, to coordinate the initial response. The shame was profound. 4 months earlier, Yamamoto's aircraft had struck America without warning. Now America had returned the blow, penetrating defenses he had assured the emperor were impregnable. In Washington, President Roosevelt played coy with reporters. When asked to confirm Japanese reports of the bombing, he smiled and said he was depending on Japanese reports very largely. Pressed for where the bombers had launched, Roosevelt grinned. From our new secret base at Shangri-La, the mystical Himalayan valley from James Hilton's novel, Lost Horizon. The quip preserved operational security, while Americans celebrated their first offensive action of the Pacific War. Morale soared. Headlines screamed from front pages across the nation. The Army Air Forces gained a powerful recruiting tool. Roosevelt enjoyed weeks of goodwill, closely identifying himself with the mission. The psychological effect proved everything Doolittle had promised. After months of defeat and despair, America had struck back. But for the 80 raiders, the mission was far from over. As the sun set over the East China Sea, their situation grew desperate. The early launch had consumed fuel reserves that might have reached Chinese airfields under the original plan. Now, with 170 extra miles to fly, the mathematics were unforgiving. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty as the bombers crossed the Chinese coast into gathering darkness. Worse, the homing beacons at Zhuzhou Airfield, their planned destination, were silent. Admiral Halsey, concerned about the task force's security after the picket boat encounter, had never transmitted the alert signal to Chinese forces. A supply aircraft carrying radio beacons had crashed en route, and when Chinese civilians heard unidentified aircraft overhead in the night, they assumed a Japanese attack and turned off all lights. The raiders faced a nightmare scenario, flying over mountainous terrain in zero visibility, fuel tanks approaching empty, no navigation aids, no landing lights, and Japanese occupation forces below in many areas. One by one, crews made the agonizing decision to abandon their aircraft. At 9:20 p.m., 13 hours after takeoff, Doolittle ordered his crew to bail out. Co-pilot Richard Cole, who had never jumped with a parachute before, pulled his ripcord so hard he gave himself a black eye. He landed in a pine tree 10 feet off the ground, tied his parachute to the branches as a hammock, and slept until morning. Doolittle came down in a rice paddy, covered in human waste from the Chinese practice of fertilizing fields with night soil. 11 crews bailed out over China. 4 attempted crash landings or ditched at sea. Only one aircraft, Captain Edward York's Crew 8, landed intact. York had known for hours that his situation was different. The replacement carburetors installed by Sacramento depot workers without Doolittle's knowledge, were burning fuel at a catastrophic rate. Long before reaching the Chinese coast, York calculated that reaching friendly territory was impossible. He made a decision that directly contradicted Doolittle's explicit orders. He turned north toward the Soviet Union. Vladivostok was significantly closer than any Chinese airfield, and the Soviets were American allies, even if they maintained neutrality with Japan under a 1941 pact. At Vozdvijenka Air Base, 40 miles north of Vladivostok, York brought his B-25 down for the only proper landing of any Doolittle aircraft. Soviet soldiers greeted the Americans warmly, offering vodka. The base commander asked if they were part of the Tokyo Raid. York admitted they were. He requested fuel to continue to China. The commander initially agreed. Then higher authority intervened. International law required the Soviets to intern combatants who entered neutral territory. Releasing the Americans would violate their neutrality pact with Japan and potentially provoke Japanese attack. The 5 crewmen, York, Lieutenant Robert Emmons, Lieutenant Nolan Herndon, Staff Sergeant Theodore Laban, and Sergeant David Pohl, began what would become 13 months of internment. They were transported by train across the vastness of Russia, eventually reaching Okansk, where they endured 7 months of brutal cold, temperatures reaching 35 to 50 degrees below zero, along with monotonous food, dysentery, and bedbugs. In March 1943, they were moved to Ashgabat in Soviet Turkmenistan, just 20 miles from the Iranian border. On May 11, 1943, the 5 Americans appeared at the British consulate in Mashhad, Iran. Their cover story claimed they had bribed an Afghan smuggler to guide them across the border. The truth, declassified decades later, was more remarkable. The entire escape had been orchestrated by the NKVD on Stalin's personal orders. The smuggler was Major Vladimir Boyarsky, a Soviet intelligence operative. The border crossing, the barbed wire, the guards looking away, all staged to give the Soviets plausible deniability with Japan while returning the airmen to their allies. Not all crews were so fortunate. Lieutenant Ted Lawson brought his bomber, nicknamed the Ruptured Duck, in low over the Chinese coast in darkness and heavy rain. Fuel exhausted, he attempted a water landing. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft broke apart as it hit the waves. Lawson was thrown through the windscreen, losing all his front teeth, his lower lip laid open to his chin, his left bicep severed in half, and his left leg badly gashed. 4 other crew members suffered serious injuries. Only Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, the 20-year-old flight engineer from Montana, escaped with minor wounds. What followed became one of the raid's defining stories of heroism. Thatcher took charge of 4 men far more injured than himself. Using his first aid kit, his handkerchief, and old dirty rags that the fishermen gave us, he bandaged wounds to stop the bleeding. He convinced Chinese guerrillas to carry the injured men inland on stretchers. For 5 grueling days, Thatcher led the group through Japanese-occupied territory toward safety. When they finally reached Dr. Thomas R. White, the flight surgeon from Crew 15 who had volunteered for the mission, Lawson's leg had become gangrenous. With no proper surgical facilities, minimal anesthesia, and using instruments sterilized in a pot of boiling water, White performed an emergency amputation. He donated 2 pints of his own blood to keep Lawson alive. Lawson survived. He would later write 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, the best-selling first-hand account of the raid that became an Academy Award-winning 1944 film starring Van Johnson and Spencer Tracy. Thatcher received the Silver Star, the only enlisted raider so honored, for his extraordinary courage in saving his crewmates' lives. 2 crews, 16 men, were not so lucky. 8 would become prisoners of the Japanese. 3 would not survive. Crew 6, piloted by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, had run out of fuel over the East China Sea. Hallmark attempted a water landing near the Chinese coast. Sergeant William Dieter and Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice drowned in the crash. Hallmark, Lieutenant Robert Meader, and Lieutenant Chase Nielsen were captured by Japanese forces. Crew 16, the last aircraft to launch, faced an even more desperate situation. Lieutenant William Farrow had flown the longest route to targets around Nagoya and had the least fuel margin. His crew bailed out near the Chinese coast and came down in Japanese-occupied territory. All 5 men, Farrow, Lieutenant Robert Height, Lieutenant George Barr, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were captured. The 8 prisoners endured horrific treatment. They were subjected to severe torture during interrogation, kept in solitary confinement, and fed starvation rations that caused dysentery and beriberi. On August 28, 1942, all 8 were tried by Japanese military tribunal on charges of war crimes for allegedly bombing civilian targets. They were never told the specific charges or given opportunity to mount a defense. All 8 were sentenced to death. The sentences were reviewed in Tokyo. The Army Ministry commuted 5. It upheld 3. On October 15, 1942, at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, age 28, Lieutenant William Farrow, age 24, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, age 21, were taken to Public Cemetery No. 1 outside Shanghai. They were placed on their knees, arms bound, blindfolded with white cloth marked by black ink over their foreheads. 3 Japanese soldiers raised rifles. The condemned men were executed simultaneously. Their bodies were immediately cremated. The 5 surviving prisoners, Nielsen, Meder, Height, Barr, and DeShazer, remained in solitary confinement on starvation rations. On December 1, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Meder died of malnutrition and disease at age 26. The remaining 4 received slightly improved treatment and a copy of the Bible. They survived until American forces liberated them in August 1945. After the war, 4 Japanese officers were tried for war crimes related to the Raiders' treatment. All were found guilty. Sentences ranged from 5 to 9 years at hard labor. In perhaps the most remarkable postscript, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, after 40 months as a prisoner, returned to college, became ordained, and spent 30 years as a Methodist missionary in Japan, preaching forgiveness to the nation that had imprisoned and tortured him. The raiders who escaped capture owed their lives to Chinese civilians who risked everything to help them. Farmers, fishermen, and villagers provided food, shelter, medical care, and guides through Japanese-occupied territory. They hid Americans in their homes, knowing that discovery meant death. The Japanese response was genocidal. In mid-May 1942, 180,000 to 200,000 Japanese troops launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, Operation Say Go, sweeping across the provinces where the raiders had come down. The official objective was to destroy Chinese airfields and capture any remaining Americans. The real purpose was collective punishment on a monstrous scale. Like a swarm of locusts, they left behind nothing but destruction and chaos, wrote Father Wendelin Dunker, an eyewitness. Entire villages suspected of helping Americans were burned to the ground. Parachutes, cigarettes, or any American items found in a community meant summary execution of men, women, and children. Women were raped. Families were massacred. Chiang Kai-shek reported to Roosevelt, "These Japanese troops slaughtered every man, woman, and child in those areas. Let me repeat, these Japanese troops slaughtered every man, woman, and child in those areas." The Japanese also deployed Unit 731, their biological warfare unit. Approximately 150 personnel spread cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, anthrax, and paratyphoid across the countryside. They poisoned wells and water sources, left contaminated food where civilians would find it, and released plague-infected fleas into fields. The biological weapons proved so indiscriminate that over 1,700 Japanese soldiers died from their own pathogens. By the time the campaign ended in September 1942, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians had been killed. Chinese military casualties exceeded 70,000. The devastation covered 20,000 square miles. This tragedy, comparable in brutality to the rape of Nanking, remains largely unknown today, overshadowed by the heroism of the raid that triggered it. The Doolittle Raid inflicted negligible material damage on Japan. 50 civilians were killed, 252 injured, and approximately 90 buildings destroyed, damage easily repaired. Compared to the B-29 firebombing campaigns that would eventually level Japanese cities, it was tactically insignificant. Strategically, it was devastating. The psychological impact struck at the foundation of Japanese military prestige. The emperor, considered divine, had been threatened. Senior commanders had promised the home islands were inviolable. American bombers had just proved them liars. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, bore special responsibility. 4 months earlier, his carriers had approached Hawaii undetected and delivered a crushing blow. Now American carriers had done the same to Japan. The humiliation was complete. The raid's most consequential effect was to accelerate Japan's fatal overreach. Before April 18th, Yamamoto had proposed attacking Midway Island to draw out and destroy American carriers. The Naval General Staff had opposed the plan. The Army was reluctant to participate. The Doolittle Raid dissolved the residual doubts. The fear of future American strikes against the homeland, fear Yamamoto had himself called unreasonable before the raid made it reality, drove Japan to extend its defensive perimeter eastward immediately. The Midway operation went forward on an accelerated timetable with inadequate preparation. Japanese forces were split between the main attack and a diversionary thrust toward the Aleutian Islands. Planning was rushed. Security was compromised. 7 weeks later, at the Battle of Midway on June 4th to 7th, 1942, American cryptanalysts who had broken the Japanese naval code positioned 3 carriers to ambush Yamamoto's fleet. In 5 devastating minutes, American dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. A 4th, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, over 200 aircraft, and hundreds of experienced pilots whose training could not be replicated. Historians generally regard Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War. The Doolittle Raid set it in motion. Additionally, Japan's obsession with protecting the homeland led to 4 Army fighter groups being retained in Japan during 1942 to 1943, when they were desperately needed in the South Pacific. Resources that might have reinforced Guadalcanal or New Guinea remained guarding against raids that never came. The defensive perimeter Japan now felt compelled to protect stretched Japanese logistics beyond sustainability. Of the 80 Doolittle Raiders, 69 escaped death or capture. 3 died in crashes or bailouts. 8 were captured. 4 of those survived captivity. All 5 interned in the Soviet Union eventually returned home. For the survivors, the raid forged bonds that lasted a lifetime. James Doolittle, who had expected court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft, instead received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt and promotion to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. He went on to command major air forces in Europe and North Africa, became a 4-star general, and served as the first president of the Air Force Association. He died in 1993 at age 96. The Raiders began holding reunions in December 1945 at a Miami hotel, a gathering reportedly so legendary for property damage that Doolittle initially protested he couldn't afford the aftermath. The reunions became annual traditions. In 1959, the city of Tucson, Arizona, presented the Raiders with 80 sterling silver goblets, each engraved twice with a member's name, once right side up, once upside down. At annual reunions, surviving Raiders would gather to drink cognac from their goblets. When a Raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. The tradition included a bottle of 1896 Hennessy cognac, Doolittle's birth year, to be opened by the last 2 survivors for a final toast to their fallen comrades. On November 9, 2013, at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, the original final toast was held publicly for the first time. 3 Raiders attended in person: Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, age 98, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Saylor, age 93, and Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, age 92. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Height, age 93, participated via live stream from Nashville. Cole broke the seal on the 1896 cognac and raised his goblet. Richard Cole lived until April 9, 2019, dying at age 103 as the last surviving Doolittle Raider. On the 81st anniversary of the raid, April 18, 2022, Cole's children, Rich Cole and Cindy Cole Chow, turned over his goblet at a ceremony in Florida. All 80 goblets now stand inverted, permanently displayed at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. The Doolittle Raid lasted approximately 30 seconds over each target, the time it took to drop bombs and escape. Yet its impact reverberated through the remaining years of the war and beyond. 80 men volunteered for a mission they knew was one way, trusting that somehow they would find a way home. 16 aircraft launched from a carrier deck in conditions that made the attempt almost suicidal. Not a single American was lost over Japan. In the desperate hours that followed, bailing out in darkness, crash landing in hostile seas, evading capture, enduring torture, dying in China and Shanghai, these men demonstrated that the spirit Pearl Harbor had tried to break remained undefeated. The raid gave America its first victory when victory seemed impossible. It planted doubt in Japanese minds about leaders who had promised invincibility. It panicked Japan's high command into strategic blunders that culminated in the catastrophe at Midway. And it cost 250,000 Chinese lives, innocent civilians who paid the ultimate price for helping 80 American strangers. In September 2016, the U.S. Air Force's newest strategic bomber, the Northrop Grumman B-21, was formally named Raider in honor of the Doolittle Raiders. Richard Cole, the last survivor, was present at the naming ceremony, still representing the brotherhood that had changed history. The silver goblets are inverted now, every name facing down. But what those 80 men achieved in April 1942 remains upright in the American memory. Proof that courage, audacity, and sacrifice can turn the tide of history 30 seconds at a time.